It all began with a free $5,000 ticket to a secluded retreat in the Cascade Mountains, promising to unlock my absolute potential. But out in the corporate trenches, you learn fast that free gifts always demand the most ruthless price. If you think a 3-day wellness seminar is just another harmless scam to pocket your cash, you have no idea how surgically a few polite people in tailored suits can dismantle your entire family. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to operate, which means we will soon be forced to stop publishing new public videos on this platform entirely. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting our work by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to exclusive true stories that are much longer, feature highly detailed situations we cannot share publicly, and include multiple emotional voice actors bringing the narratives to life. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the link located in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, told through the perspective of a woman named Janet Flynn. At 32 years old, my life was an endless, high-speed balancing act. As a director of strategy at Nexus Grid Dynamics, a major tech firm based in Seattle, my daily routine was consumed by corporate risk assessments, data algorithms, and cutthroat board meetings. My nights and weekends, however, were dedicated to a much softer, far more fragile priority, which was my widowed mother, Martha. Ever since my father passed away 5 years ago, a quiet but profound loneliness had settled over her large, empty house. I tried my best to fill that void. I bought her expensive dinners, scheduled weekend brunches, and called her every single evening on my drive home. But deep down, I knew it was never enough. A busy, career-driven daughter can never truly replace the comforting, steady presence of a life partner. So, when my mother mentioned she had recently joined a local social club for affluent retirees, I felt a massive wave of genuine relief. That relief only multiplied when she introduced me to Eleanor and Richard Sterling. They were a highly polished, incredibly wealthy couple who seemed to have taken my mother under their wing. They drove European luxury cars, wore understated designer clothing, and spoke with the smooth, practiced charm of old money. At first glance, they were exactly the kind of harmless, well-connected friends I desperately wanted my mother to have. But within a few weeks, the subtle changes in her behavior became entirely impossible to ignore. Mom was certainly happier, almost unnervingly bright, but her entire vocabulary had shifted. Over our usual Sunday coffee, she completely stopped talking about her garden or the harmless neighborhood gossip. Instead, she began dropping strange, highly clinical phrases into casual conversation. She talked about aligning her core energy and breaking through her limiting frequency barriers. It sounded exactly like the rehearsed script of a cheap, late-night self-help guru. When I gently asked her where she was picking up these bizarre new catchphrases, her eyes lit up with a sudden, feverish intensity. She told me she had just returned from a highly secretive 3-day seminar called Personal Mastery. I asked her what exactly they did during those 3 days, expecting her to describe some basic yoga, meditation, or perhaps some gentle group therapy. Instead, her smile tightened unnaturally, and she leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. "I cannot tell you, Janet," she said. "Sharing the methodology with outsiders would break the sacred covenant of the circle. You have to experience the awakening for yourself." In my line of work at Nexus Grid Dynamics, absolute secrecy is the ultimate red flag. When someone tells you they have a life-changing product but firmly refuses to explain how it actually works, they are hiding a severe defect, or worse, they are hiding a trap. My mind, which is naturally wired for corporate skepticism, immediately went on high alert. The breaking point arrived exactly 2 days later. I was sitting in my glass-walled office, reviewing a massive quarterly report, when Mom called my personal phone. She was practically breathless with excitement, her words rushing out in a dizzying flood. "Janet, "You will absolutely never believe it," she gushed through the speaker. "Richard has anonymous VIP points with the organization, and he just used them to fully sponsor your attendance for the next seminar. It is a $5,000 ticket. Darling, fully paid for. You are going to the Cascade Mountains next week." Before I could even begin to process the sheer absurdity of a virtual stranger spending $5,000 on me, my phone began to buzz relentlessly. It was Eleanor and Richard. First came the text messages, overflowing with heart emojis and an incredibly toxic level of positivity, telling me how thrilled they were to welcome me to their family. Then came the corporate-styled emails. They forwarded me an extremely detailed itinerary, showing that they had already booked a premium hotel suite in my name at a highly secluded resort deep in the Cascades. They did all of this without asking for my permission even once. It was an absolute masterclass in aggressive hospitality. Under the flawless guise of overwhelming generosity, they were building a cage, creating an immense, invisible social pressure that intentionally left no room for me to say no. But they drastically underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I did not survive the ruthless corporate tech industry by bending to cheap social pressure. "Mom, I am not going," I told her firmly that evening, pacing around my apartment living room. "This feels completely wrong. Normal people do not just drop that kind of money on their new friend's daughter, and I do not like being forced into an isolated trip I never agreed to." The reaction was instantaneous and entirely devastating. Mom broke down into heavy, gasping sobs right there on the phone. She did not just sound disappointed. She sounded like I had betrayed her on a fundamental, cellular level. "You are constantly pushing me away," she cried, her voice trembling with a dark, bitter anger I had never once heard from her before. "Richard and Eleanor are offering you a beautiful gift to heal our family trauma, to finally fix the emotional distance between us. And you are just throwing it in my face because you think you are so much smarter than everyone else." Standing there in the quiet of my apartment, listening to my own mother aggressively parrot the toxic psychological manipulation they had fed her, the tension between us stretched to a terrifying, heartbreaking extreme. I realized in that exact moment that I was not just dealing with a financial scam, I was fighting a desperate war for my mother's mind. Arguing with someone who has been systematically brainwashed is a completely pointless endeavor. I realized this the exact moment the call ended, leaving me standing in the suffocating silence of my living room. I did not shed a single tear, nor did I call my mother back to apologize. Instead, I walked straight to my home office, locked the door, and booted up my encrypted Nexus Grid Dynamics workstation. If Eleanor and Richard Sterling wanted to play a high-stakes game, they were about to learn that they had dragged the wrong woman onto the board. My first move was to trace the digital footprint of Personal Mastery, using the advanced data scraping algorithms I normally employed to analyze our corporate competitors. I began tearing apart the organization's public facade. What I found was a vast, empty black hole. There was absolutely no legitimate business registration on file anywhere in the United States. The venue in the mountains was rented through a labyrinth of anonymous offshore trusts based in the Cayman Islands. By cross-referencing property tax records and event permits, I uncovered a chilling pattern. The organization never stayed in one place, and they completely changed their operational name every 2 years. 2 years ago, they were known as the Inner Light Initiative. 4 years ago, they operated in Chicago under the banner of the Apex Mindset Collective. They functioned exactly like a parasitic virus, mutating their identity the moment the host environment became too hostile. Armed with the Chicago alias, I dove deep into anonymous survivor forums and encrypted message boards. It took me until 3 o'clock in the morning to find exactly what I was looking for. Under a heavily redacted thread discussing corporate fraud, I tracked down a former attendee. We connected through a secure, self-destructing chat channel. The person on the other end was a former hedge fund manager who had lost absolutely everything: his career, his marriage, and his entire fortune after attending a similar retreat run by the exact same group 4 years ago. They do not sell vitamins, and they do not push multi-level marketing schemes. the former attendee typed, his words appearing on my screen like a dark prophecy. They deal in something far more dangerous. They traffic in human leverage. He explained the horrific reality of the course. The organizers isolate the attendees, deprive them of sleep, and subject them to intense psychological manipulation disguised as extreme therapy. They break down the participants until they reach a state of absolute emotional vulnerability. Then comes what they call the cleansing session. In a dark room, surrounded by peers, they force you to confess your darkest, most ruinous secrets, or your most fatal personal flaws. And here is the trap, the stranger continued. Every single word in those confession rooms is illegally recorded using hidden audio and video equipment. The moment you hand them your deepest shame, they own you forever. The blood ran freezing cold in my veins as the monstrous architecture of the scam finally revealed itself. The organization used those illegal recordings to blackmail their victims, but they did not just want cash. They demanded fresh prey. The compromised attendees were forced to become recruiters, ordered to lure in highly influential individuals, wealthy heirs, or high-ranking corporate executives. If they failed to deliver the required quota of new victims, their darkest secrets would be leaked to their employers, their spouses, and the press. The sickening truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Eleanor and Richard Sterling were not generous philanthropists. They were not my mother's wonderful new friends. They were desperate, terrified hostages caught in an extortion ring, scrambling to pay off their own spiritual debt by serving up fresh meat. And my sweet, lonely mother was nothing more than the shiny bait they had dangled in the water to catch a much larger fish. That larger fish was me, but the most terrifying realization was yet to come. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly at the glowing monitors, asking myself the ultimate question: why me? Why was an anonymous donor willing to drop $5,000 to bring me into the fold? I pulled up my own corporate profile on the Nexus Grid network. I was not just a strategy director. For the past 6 months, I had been the primary oversight officer for our new quantum energy grid project. I held the master encryption keys to a prototype algorithm worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The organization did not care about my emotional well-being or my family trauma. They had profiled me. They knew exactly what I had access to. The $5,000 ticket was not a gift. It was a highly targeted investment. They intended to break me down in the Cascade Mountains, record a manufactured confession, and blackmail me into handing over the proprietary code that powered Nexus Grid Dynamics. I closed my laptop, the screen going black, leaving me in the dark. The invisible cage they had built around my family was flawless, legal, and utterly lethal. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I would act like prey. The very next morning, I drove straight to my mother's house with a thick folder of printed documents. I laid out the court records, the bankruptcies, and the agonizing testimonies of ruined lives across her pristine dining table. I begged her to look at the undeniable proof that the organization had been sued multiple times for severe fraud and emotional distress under their various previous names. But staring into her eyes was like looking at an entirely different person. She did not even blink. She calmly pushed the massive stack of papers away, her voice adopting that same terrifying, heavily rehearsed serenity. "These are simply tests of faith from the universe, Janet," she whispered softly, folding her hands together. "Dark energy always tries to tear down the enlightened. You are letting your corporate fear block your spiritual evolution." There was absolutely no reasoning with her. The psychological programming had taken root deep within the very fabric of her mind. The suffocating pressure quickly spilled over from my personal life into my professional sanctuary. 2 days later, I walked into the soaring glass lobby of Nexus Grid Dynamics, only to find Richard Sterling sitting casually on a leather guest sofa. My stomach instantly plummeted to the polished marble floor. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, holding a cup of artisan coffee, looking every bit like a wealthy tech investor. When he saw me, he stood up and spread his arms in a warm, suffocating greeting. "Janet," he smiled, though his cold eyes remained entirely dead. I was just in the area meeting with some prominent venture capitalists and thought I would drop by to see where the real magic happens. I kept my distance, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth genuinely ached. I politely told him I was late for a highly secure executive briefing. Richard took a slow sip of his coffee and leaned in just a fraction of an inch. "I completely understand," he said smoothly, lowering his voice. "A woman in your powerful position must have her hands incredibly full, especially with the new quantum energy project entering its final encryption phase. It would be a terrible shame if all that brilliant hard work was compromised because of, say, a sudden emotional family crisis. We really hope to see you up in the mountains next week to help you manage all this heavy stress." He knew exactly what classified project I was running. It was a perfectly executed, chilling threat, wrapped tightly in a polite, ordinary conversation. Panic began to claw viciously at my throat. I rushed back up to my secure office and dialed my mother's number, but it went straight to a generic automated voicemail. I immediately called her next-door neighbor, who casually mentioned that a black luxury van had picked Mom up over an hour ago. Eleanor Sterling had convinced my mother to temporarily move into a heavily guarded, private residential villa owned entirely by the organization. Eleanor claimed my mother needed to prepare her spirit for the next level of awakening, entirely free from the negative frequencies of non-believers, which specifically and intentionally meant me. They had physically isolated her behind towering iron gates and armed private security guards, cleanly cutting off all my lines of communication with her. The psychological warfare did not stop there. That same evening, an encrypted anonymous email bypassed all my advanced personal spam filters. There was no text in the body of the message, just a series of high-resolution image attachments. I clicked the very first image and felt the breath knock entirely out of my lungs. It was a photograph of me and my mother having a quiet lunch over 3 months ago, taken from a great distance through a professional telephoto lens. The next photo was of me walking to my car in the company parking lot late at night. The third was a crystal-clear shot through my second-story apartment window, capturing me sitting alone on my sofa just 2 nights prior. They had been watching us for months. Every single interaction between my mother and the Sterlings had been a meticulously engineered, highly calculated performance. I was trapped in a terrifying panopticon, constantly observed by a wealthy, invisible predator. By Friday morning, the walls began to violently close in on my career. 2 of our most crucial external data partners abruptly canceled their lucrative vendor contracts without any standard warning. When I cornered one of the account managers on a secure phone line, he awkwardly dodged my direct questions before quietly hinting that deeply disturbing rumors were actively circulating within the tech industry. Unnamed sources were actively claiming that the director of strategy at NexusGrid was suffering a severe mental breakdown and was no longer fit to handle highly classified corporate secrets. The organization was systematically poisoning the well, deliberately destroying my professional credibility to ensure that if I ever tried to blow the whistle, I would be instantly dismissed as a paranoid, unstable woman. I sat alone in my dark office, tightly clutching my phone, finally realizing the terrifying brilliance of their overarching strategy. I simply could not go to the authorities. If I walked into a federal police station and told them that a wealthy couple was inviting me to a free wellness retreat and that my adult mother had willingly moved into their luxurious guest house, the detectives would literally laugh me right out of the precinct. There was absolutely no crime written on paper. No physical violence had occurred. No ransom note had been explicitly delivered. I was fighting legal ghosts, terrifying shadows that could effortlessly bankrupt my company, completely destroy my hard-earned reputation, and permanently steal my mother, all while smiling brightly in the broad daylight. I was completely cornered, entirely stripped of my standard corporate defenses, with nowhere left to run. If I am cornered by a phantom, I must become a ghost myself. The next morning, I picked up my phone, intentionally adopting a shaky, defeated tone, and called Eleanor Sterling. When she answered, I let out a long, ragged sigh, the kind that only comes from total spiritual exhaustion. "Eleanor," I whispered, making sure my voice cracked just a fraction. "You were right. You were completely right about everything. I am falling apart. My career is collapsing around me. My stress levels are destroying my mind, and I just cannot carry this burden anymore. I need help. I need the guidance you and Richard offered." The smug satisfaction radiating through the phone line was practically thick enough to choke on. Eleanor cooed softly, offering a sickeningly sweet web of validation, telling me how brave I was for finally surrendering to the process. Within 10 minutes, I was on a video call with my mother, who was weeping tears of absolute joy, fully convinced that the universe had finally humbled her stubborn daughter. They genuinely thought the trap had snapped shut around my neck. They thought the wild animal had finally starved enough to walk willingly into the cage. They had absolutely no idea that they had just invited a Trojan horse straight through their front gates. I had exactly 72 hours before the seminar began. I did not spend that time packing yoga pants or meditation journals. Instead, I descended into the subterranean sublevels of the Nexus Grid Dynamics headquarters. There, in a soundproof server room, I held a strictly off-the-books meeting with our lead cybersecurity engineer and a ruthless private corporate fixer I had hired, a man whose entire legal practice revolved around utterly destroying corporate extortionists. "If we go to the authorities now, we have nothing but a conspiracy theory," the lawyer explained, his voice like grinding gravel. "We need them to commit a highly documented, undeniable federal felony on tape. We need to hand the Federal Bureau of Investigation a silver platter." That is precisely what we built. The engineering team went to work on my personal belongings. They surgically implanted military-grade microchip recording devices into the silver backing of my pearl earrings and the clasp of my everyday wristwatch. These were not standard commercial bugs. They were passive listening devices designed to evade commercial frequency sweepers. Then, they handed me a newly constructed smartphone. Outwardly, it looked like a standard commercial device, but its internal architecture had been entirely gutted. It emitted zero radio frequency when dormant, making it completely invisible to standard security wands. But it contained a localized signal hijacking protocol that could penetrate heavily encrypted local networks. When Friday afternoon arrived, I drove my car up the winding, treacherous roads of the Cascade Mountains, pulling into the heavily fortified gates of the secluded luxury resort. The organization was not taking any chances. Before I was even allowed to see my mother or enter my suite, two large men in tailored suits politely but firmly confiscated my luggage and scanned my body with handheld metal detectors. My heart pounded a heavy rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of nervous exhaustion. The wand passed right over my earrings, my watch, and the custom phone in my pocket without making a single sound. I was in. The first 2 days of the seminar were a masterclass in psychological torture disguised as enlightenment. They starved us of sleep, keeping us awake for nearly 20 hours a day with relentless group therapy sessions, aggressive fasting protocols, and disorienting light and sound frequencies. I watched wealthy executives, successful doctors, and brilliant artists slowly regress into sobbing, vulnerable children. I played my part flawlessly, weeping on command, staring at the floor, and letting my shoulders slump in manufactured defeat. On the third night, the true objective of the retreat commenced. We were led into a subterranean concrete room lit only by a few flickering candles. This was the cleansing session. One by one, the attendees were called to the center of the circle, heavily pressured by the facilitators to confess their most ruinous sins. When it was finally my turn, I knelt on the cold floor, letting tears stream down my face, and activated the microchip in my earring with a subtle press of my finger. "I am a fraud," I sobbed, looking directly at the lead facilitator, knowing full well there were hidden cameras recording every single frame of my breakdown. "My company thinks I am protecting our assets, but the truth is, I am crumbling. Nexus Grid Dynamics is secretly preparing to acquire a massive, publicly traded lithium mining corporation based in Canada next week. The deal is strictly confidential, If anyone knew the acquisition was happening, they could buy the mining stock right now for pennies and make tens of millions of dollars the second the news goes public. I have the internal codes. I have the exact stock ticker. I am so terrified of the power I hold. I did not give them the encryption keys to our quantum energy project. Instead, I fed them a meticulously fabricated, completely fictional corporate acquisition. It was a flawless bait. The organization ran on greed, and I had just handed them a golden ticket. By recording my confession and acting on that specific financial information, they would not just be committing extortion, they would be stepping straight into a massive, undeniable case of federal insider trading. The trap was set, but I was not done. I needed the final nail in their coffin. 2 hours later, the entire camp was plunged into a mandatory, deeply immersive meditation session in the main hall. The facilitators dimmed the lights entirely and played a deafening drone of binaural beats to induce a trance state. Under the cover of total darkness, I slipped silently out the back exit of the hall and crept into the empty administrative wing of the resort. I found the main server terminal locked behind a heavy glass door. I did not need a physical key. I pulled the custom smartphone from my pocket and ran a brute force decryption protocol our tech team had installed. It took exactly 4 agonizing minutes for the screen to flash green. The heavy door clicked open. I slid into the server room, connected my phone directly to their central mainframe, and began siphoning everything. I bypassed their local firewalls and accessed the hidden, encrypted drives. The sheer volume of human suffering stored in those folders was staggering. I watched the progress bar inch forward, downloading thousands of illegal video recordings, blackmail ledgers, offshore bank account routing numbers, and the private contact information of every single victim they had ever compromised. The transfer hit 100%, just as I heard heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway outside. I yanked the cable, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and vanished into the shadows, armed with enough digital ammunition to burn their entire empire to the ground. The bait worked with terrifying efficiency. Less than 3 hours after I completed the server heist, the trap violently snapped shut. It was the final night of the retreat, and the camp was hosting a silent midnight reception. As I stood near the edge of the terrace, staring out into the pitch-black forest, the lead facilitator approached me. His name was Silas, a man with hollow, dead eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me away from the crowd, leading me into a heavily soundproofed administrative office. He did not waste a single breath on spiritual jargon or cosmic energy. Silas pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen. The room filled with the crisp, undeniable audio recording of my tearful confession from earlier that evening, explicitly detailing the fake corporate acquisition of the Canadian mining company. When the audio finished, Silas set the tablet down and leaned against the desk, dropping the enlightened guru facade entirely. The corporate world is incredibly stressful, Janet, Silas said, his voice dripping with cold malice. And keeping a multi-million-dollar secret like that can weigh heavily on a person's soul. But we can help you carry that burden. In fact, if you transfer the master encryption algorithm for your quantum energy project to our private servers by Monday morning, we will make sure this little audio clip never reaches the Securities and Exchange Commission. We would hate to see you go to federal prison for corporate espionage. I forced my hands to shake. I looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Playing the role of the broken executive perfectly, I discreetly pressed my thumb against the silver clasp of my wristwatch, activating the secondary microchip. "You are extorting me," I whispered, making sure to explicitly state the nature of the crime for the hidden microphone. "You want me to steal the highly classified quantum algorithm from Nexus Grid Dynamics, or you will ruin my life." Silas smiled, a chilling, triumphant grin. "We prefer to call it a mutual energy exchange, and do not even think about running to the authorities. Eleanor and Richard Sterling have already routed our charitable donations through 3 different offshore shell companies. The money is entirely untraceable, and you are the only one on tape committing a federal offense. You have exactly 48 hours. Janet." He had just handed me the world on a silver platter. I had him dead to rights on tape committing felony extortion, and he had arrogantly implicated the Sterlings in an international money laundering scheme. The moment the sun rose, I packed my bags, maintained my terrified masquerade, and drove my car straight down the mountain. But I did not go home. I drove directly to a highly secure underground parking facility in downtown Seattle, where my private corporate fixer was leaning against the hood of his car, waiting for me. We did not waste a single second. We walked the decrypted hard drive and the audio recording straight into the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, joined by a senior investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. When we laid the evidence on the massive conference table, the federal agents were utterly stunned. We handed them a perfectly wrapped, undeniable package of premeditated wire fraud, international money laundering, systemic extortion, and intent to commit massive insider trading. But handing over the evidence was only the first half of my counterattack. I wanted to completely obliterate their foundation. Using the stolen contact list from the server, I spent the next 24 hours operating out of a secure conference room, personally calling the most prominent former victims. I spoke to bankrupt doctors, disgraced hedge fund managers, and shattered executives. They were terrified to speak to me at first, completely paralyzed by the blackmail holding their lives hostage. But the moment I told them the central server was in federal custody and offered them absolute ironclad legal protection entirely pro bono through my corporate legal team, their paralyzing fear rapidly transformed into blistering fury. Within 2 days, we had over 50 wealthy, powerful individuals ready to file a devastating class action lawsuit that would drown the organization in decades of litigation. But the hardest part of the war was not destroying the syndicate. It was breaking my mother's heart. I intercepted her the exact moment the organization's luxury black van dropped her back at her suburban driveway. I did not let her go inside her house. I swiftly packed her into the passenger seat of my car and drove her to an anonymous corporate safe house I had rented on the edge of the city. She was absolutely furious, screaming at me about my toxic energy and threatening to call Richard and Eleanor to come rescue her. I did not argue. I gently sat her down on a heavy leather sofa in front of a massive television screen and plugged in a secure flash drive. I am not asking you to believe a single word I say. Mom, I told her softly, my voice breaking slightly. Just watch the screen. I played the hidden security footage I had pulled directly from the resort's administrative servers. It was a crystal clear video of Eleanor and Richard Sterling sitting in a private lounge, drinking terribly expensive champagne and laughing hysterically. Eleanor was casually calling my mother a pathetic, desperate old widow who was so starved for a friend that she would happily follow them right off a cliff. Richard brutally mocked her grief over my father, laughing about how incredibly easy it had been to weaponize her loneliness to trap her highly valuable daughter. The artificial spiritual facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide with absolute horror as she watched the people she loved and trusted tear her soul apart for sheer profit. The realization that her profound loneliness had been weaponized as a cheap marketing tool destroyed her. She covered her face with her hands and collapsed forward, weeping with a guttural, earth-shattering agony that tore right through my chest. I sat down beside her, wrapped my arms tightly around her shaking shoulders, and held her as she cried. It was a brutal, devastating moment, but for the first time in months, there was no manipulation, there was no fake cosmic energy, there was only a mother and a daughter, finally united by the brutal truth, standing side by side as the storm prepared to break. The hammer fell exactly 1 week later. On a crisp Saturday evening, Eleanor and Richard Sterling were hosting a breathtakingly extravagant charity gala at a rented waterfront mansion overlooking Lake Washington. The ballroom was packed with Seattle's wealthiest elite, a fresh crop of oblivious prey ready to be harvested for the organization's next cycle of extortion. The champagne was flowing, a string quartet was playing softly in the background, and the Sterlings were working the room with their trademark predatory charm. They never even saw the raid coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the mansion burst open. The string quartet screeched to a halt as dozens of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission flooded the ballroom. The elegant party instantly devolved into a chaotic chorus of screaming socialites and crashing champagne flutes. I walked through the grand entrance right behind the lead investigators, wearing a sharp black suit and a very cold, deeply satisfied smile. I spotted Eleanor and Richard immediately. They were pinned against a grand piano, their designer evening wear violently contrasted by the heavy steel handcuffs being ratcheted tightly around their wrists. When Richard locked eyes with me, the color completely drained from his perfectly tanned face. He finally understood. I walked slowly across the marble floor until I was standing inches away from them. Eleanor was trembling uncontrollably, her artificial serene mask entirely shattered. "You really thought you could play corporate warfare with my family," I said quietly, ensuring only they could hear me over the chaos. "I am the one who fed you the fake Canadian mining acquisition. I am the one who downloaded your entire blackmail server. And as of exactly 1 hour ago, the federal government has permanently frozen every single one of your offshore shell accounts. You are completely bankrupt, and you are going to federal prison." Desperation is an ugly, pathetic thing to witness. Eleanor's wild eyes darted past my shoulder, landing on the woman standing quietly just a few feet behind me. It was my mother. Martha stood tall, her posture completely rigid, her face an unreadable mask of stone. "Martha," Eleanor sobbed, dragging her handcuffed wrists forward, attempting to reach out. "Martha, please help us. Tell them this is a terrible misunderstanding. We are your spiritual family. We are your true friends." My mother did not flinch. She stepped forward, looked the crying woman dead in the eye, and violently swatted Eleanor's outstretched hands away. "You are nothing but a cheap, pathetic con artist," my mother said, her voice ringing with a fierce, absolute clarity I had not heard since my father was alive. "Do not ever speak to me or my daughter again." The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. The takedown became the biggest high society scandal of the decade. Silas and the other masterminds behind the fake wellness retreat were denied bail, facing decades in federal prison for massive wire fraud, systemic extortion, and large-scale insider trading. The civil class action lawsuit filed by the former victims completely liquidated whatever assets the organization had left. Back at Nexus Grid Dynamics, the executive board held a private meeting to officially commend me for ruthlessly protecting the company's intellectual property. The quantum energy algorithm remained perfectly secure. But the truest victory had absolutely nothing to do with corporate data or federal indictments. 2 weeks after the raid, the world had finally gone quiet. It was a beautiful Sunday morning, and I was sitting on the balcony of my Seattle apartment, holding 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee. My mother stepped out into the cool morning air and sat down in the chair next to me. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city skyline. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavy, ridiculous crystal amulets the organization had forced her to buy, and casually tossed them straight into the metal trash can. She took a sip of her coffee, let out a long, peaceful sigh, and reached over to gently squeeze my hand. We did not need to talk about spiritual frequencies or cosmic energy. We had survived the darkest, most sophisticated trap imaginable, and we had done it together. Real healing does not cost $5,000, and it certainly does not require a secret mountain retreat. Real healing is found in the fierce, unbreakable willingness to protect the people you love, no matter how ruthless you have to become to save them. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It truly means the world to me. Where are you listening to this story from right now? Please let me know in the comments section. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help us keep creating, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description and the comments below. Have a wonderful day.